NFL Week 1 instant reactions, our recaps, our thoughts. That's what we're doing today on RotoViz Overtime. NFL Week 1 is not fully in the books. We have Monday Night Football to go, but we are through the vast majority of the games, obviously from Thursday all the way through to the Sunday night game. We're going to talk through some of them today. We'll talk through more thoughts on our second show of the week. And Shawn and Ben jumped together to record a Stealing Bananas episode just before we started recording this. So there will be some of the games that we don't talk about today that we'll mention towards the end that will be obviously discussed over on the Stealing Bananas episode. So I would highly recommend making sure you listen to that one after you finish up on this episode. Shawn, Week 1, look, I'm glad the NFL is back. My fantasy games are going in the right direction. Some of them, I would say, maybe the majority of the main ones. But in terms of the games, there were some games that were very entertaining, some games that were not entertaining in any way at all. That, you know, last year we joked, I think off air, about certain teams that just they were not worth watching last year. But there's a couple of teams, Shawn, so far that, I don't know, Week 2, maybe their last chance to get full game coverage from my side. But I enjoyed it as a whole. But obviously we'll talk to, you know, some really disappointing injury news, some really disappointing team performances, but also some electric team performances, the likes of the Miami Dolphins. So lots of stuff to dive into. How are you feeling at this point of NFL Week 1?
Good and bad, right? The injuries just always upset you, both from a fantasy perspective, but also from the perspective of what it means for those guys. And I think that, you know, you convince yourself that it's not going to be that bad, or you convince yourself that like this was the worst year ever for soft tissue injuries and different things like that before the season even started. I mean, you think about guys who were going in the first handful of picks as recently as, 7-8 days ago. You think about Cooper Kupp, Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews. Missing those names isn't fun. And there were certain
even
teams,
if you go into the second round, I know it's more than that time frame that you mentioned, but the likes of a Jonathan Taylor,
sure,
also not playing. Then even if you go down a couple of rounds, you mentioned the soft tissue injuries. We had Christian Watson not playing today. There was just so many players that weren't available to start off the season, and then more piled on top of that today, obviously.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, you go through most of the things that happened in Week 1, and I feel really good about our analysis of the teams and the players. And I think that part of it, you're always hoping that you get mostly right. The games that stand out as being really weird outcomes where I think fans have to be upset. Certainly the Kansas City Chiefs looked just awful opening up their Super Bowl defense. The Cincinnati Bengals looked far, far worse than that. But we know that the Bengals do that. In the first month of the season, the Bengals will have like 3 games where they look like they've never practiced. And then they're going to be in it at the end of the year. So again, you don't worry about it too much, other than if you have Jamar Chase, you're like, well, I wish there would be some fantasy points.
Or if you had T. Higgins. 0 fantasy points.
Good. T. Higgins and Drake London really, really getting it done in Week 1. And then you look at a team like the Steelers that has just been a traditional juggernaut dynasty, what have you, and a lot of reason for optimism with how well Kenny Pickett had played in the preseason. They've got the young weapons. For them to be so thoroughly dismantled at home, they're going to be upset. And then the fourth kind of big result, I think, featured your team, Colm, where there was a lot of reason to be excited about the Chicago Bears, and there was a lot of reason for skepticism and concern in Green Bay, and your Packers just absolutely annihilated them, at least as far as I can tell. That's one of the games I haven't worked my way through.
Oh, no, they annihilated them.
It is kind of funny. I do want to give a little bit of congratulations to our robot overlords, because you always want to curry favor when you can. Colin, I think I perhaps have joked on the show before that I've never watched an episode of Stealing Bananas or an episode of RotoViz Overtime, but anytime I open up YouTube, those are the videos that come up. So I mean, we know our devices are listening and reporting back to their friends. So I just want to say that in the initial day of NFL Sunday Ticket on YouTube, that the YouTube interface, as soon as I figured it out, worked very, very nicely. It was actually a little better than using a normal TV DVR. So
sounds like Shawn's looking for some sort of a sponsorship deal here from
well, certainly if they wanted to let us have that package for free, it's like $399, Colm. So throw that in there.
And I'll shout out too, I didn't have as comfortable of an experience for people in Europe. NFL Game Pass has been the way I've watched games for many years, but this year it's been taken over by DAZN, and I've had very little issues over the time, whereas a lot of people would have complained about the previous setup. And I didn't have a huge amount of issues today, but anytime that you would pause the game to walk away, it would come back and your internet connection had gone. So there was quite a bit of refresh and getting things going, but we got there in the end. So teething problems. Hopefully, like some of these NFL teams, it's just teething problems in week 1.
I don't know if you want to risk, again, upsetting the AIs that are in charge of all this column. But so we have that element out of the way, and there's no other place to start but week 1 of the 2023 season, and we got the full Sam Howell experience.
We definitely did. We got it in a couple of different ways, Shawn. I'm interested in your thoughts as we roll through this. So the Cardinals obviously were a team we thought would really struggle going into this game, and they did struggle for the vast majority of it in terms of moving the ball, but they did keep it close. They led this game at halftime 13-10. We got Sam Howell early in the game. Look, it takes a big hit, but then they're moving the ball. They get the touchdown to Brian Robinson, which I thought was a positive sign both for Brian Robinson and also a very nice improvised throw by Howell. So I was pretty pumped at that point in the first quarter, and then it kind of quietened down until that fourth quarter. But they continued to be able to move the ball, just not punch it into the end zone. But we get the rushing touchdown then to finish the game off, and that was one of my favorite moments of the entire day because my daughter was getting ready to go to bed because it's in Ireland, and she comes in, she's sitting beside me, and I'm like, I really want this guy to score. I want him to throw it to another player. She had no interest, and she just sat there, and then he scored, and I jumped up, and she just proceeded to laugh for, I would say, 3 minutes straight as I pretended to continue to celebrate the entire time. So that was quite enjoyable. But this game, in terms of the Washington Commanders, they were led by not Logan Thomas, but almost Shawn. 8 targets for Logan Thomas, 4 receptions, 43 yards. Curtis Samuel had 5 targets, 5 receptions, 54. Terry McLaurin, 4 targets, just Dotson, 7 targets, 5 receptions, 40 yards. So it really was spread around. It was they did throw the ball downfield, but no real deep connections at all in this one for Sam Howell. But finishes 19 of 31, 202, 1 touchdown, 1 interception, and then has the 11 yards, 1 touchdown on 2 rushes. So didn't run as much as I was expecting. The one thing I would say in this, I was disappointed, and obviously you want your players to continue to try, and we just want teams to continue to try and score. The Commanders did really kind of sit on the ball for the remainder of the game. Once they did get that marginal lead, they really didn't try and to push it down and blow this team out. And that for me would be a concern as a Washington fan against this Cardinals team with Josh Dobbs, that you're not really trying to ramp it up from that point forward. What were your key takeaways from the Sam Howell experience? Good, bad, in the middle?
Well, we got more rushing than it looks like superficially, because a lot of the sacks were plays where he's tackled.
Lost 46 yards on 6 sacks.
He did, but most of the sacks were of the short yardage variety. You have a couple of really egregious ones in there as well, and I wouldn't necessarily put those sacks on him. It is going to be one of those things to track, though, because the Sam Howell sack rate has been heavily discussed, and it's something where either Washington is going to have to do a better job in their protections, because they were awful. One of the things that was kind of cool in this game is that the Arizona Cardinals are absolutely terrible, and they're obviously taking a completely non-competitive approach globally, but at the play level and at the player level, they played with incredible intensity. in the first half. And I would argue that maybe even over the line in the first quarter, they needed to get those guys settled down. I really felt like the hit on Howell was one of the dirtiest hits we've seen.
It was pretty bad.
That kind of play needs to have an ejection, right? But big picture again, I mean, the Cardinals played really hard, and they had a handful of pretty cool plays. We had Rondale Moore looking very fast. We had a couple of plays in there to Marquise Brown. I mean, again, this is why you didn't want to draft Marquise Brown this year, is that I actually felt like it was a good game for him within the context of the situation, and he caught 3 passes for 28 yards. If that's actually a pretty good game, that person is undraftable. And so, that element of it is problematic. I do think it was funny that, so maybe the most triggering element of week 1 was you've got a Cardinals team that is completely non-competitive, and they have a team where they've got like this 75-year-old tight end who's been injured. And they also have maybe the NFL's most athletic tight end. Because again, the reason that you're interested in Trey McBride is that he was a superstar in college and is maybe the most athletic tight end. You think about some of the other guys who would be in the mix for that. The fact that Trey McBride is probably more athletic is noteworthy. This game in the final line is so funny because Zach Ertz,
there's 12 targets between the tight ends.
Zach Ertz easily led the team in targets. 10 targets for Zach Ertz, 2 targets for Trey McBride. Trey McBride wins the yardage battle 23-21. Because when you throw the ball 10 times to Zach Ertz, about what you're expecting to get is 21 yards.
Yeah, that was the most disappointing part. I was looking throughout the game to see if McBride had an injury or what had happened, but I think this is part of what you're going to get when you have a quarterback the likes of Doubs in there. And the game plan and the performance overall from the Cardinals, you mentioned the physicality, that works in one way. But offensively, both teams had their moments. Obviously, more moments in this for Washington, but Arizona really did struggle. Doubs had 132 passing yards. They had 96 rushing yards in the game. James Conner, 62. But nothing at all in that passing game. And, when you have 30 targets and a third of those go to Zach Ertz, and Ertz was a player I really liked in his time with Philadelphia. I didn't think he had his true potential, but this version of him is past his best. And when he's getting 30% of your team's targets, that's an issue.
Well, and we also love James Conner. I mean, he's been a big part of some of our teams in the past. So this is not, any kind of targeted at these particular guys. But when you look at Ertz and Conner together, they currently have the athleticism of a late stage Tom Brady. And so when those two players combine for 15 targets and Rondale Moore, Marquise Brown, Trey McBride, and Michael Wilson combine for 14 targets, that's a problem. It's also amusing because Zach Ertz and James Conner combined for 15 targets and only 29 yards. So, if you're Marvin Jones, that's still a pretty decent line. If you are a starting Chiefs receiver, that's a pretty decent line. But if you were an otherwise viable NFL player, those are not competitive stats that you're putting up. So the Cardinals have some things that they need to shift around.
They definitely have some things they need to work on. I think they'll get better. This felt to me like a game where Washington had their starting quarterback, obviously a second-year player, but getting his first big start. They kind of are at home. They're expected to win. Lots of pressure on them going into it. I felt like this was a game where they played down to their opponent. They give their opponent the opportunity. Sam Howell has the fumble that leads to the defensive recovery for a touchdown. And then after that, it was a case of just kind of a war of attrition. I think we'll see both of these teams have much better performances throughout the year, but there was a couple of games this week where we've seen teams kind of both almost afraid to lose rather than trying to go and win. And that there was one of them.
Well, the interesting part in this game, I think, is that it was a little bit of a tale of two halves in terms of how Washington attacked it. Because, how you see Sam Howell after week 1 is going to really determine or be determined by how you saw him coming in. Because if you saw him coming in as someone who is not necessarily a true future NFL starter, then you saw a lot of red flags. And if you were worried about his willingness or ability to take care of the ball, then the interception, and then there were 2 more passes in the game that, I mean, very easily could have been picked. And so if those, and it's kind of one of these things too, where the outcomes matter, because if those 2 passes are picked, then you know the Commanders tonight are looking at this game and like maybe already are thinking a little bit about going to Jakobi Brissett. Now, I think that's probably not the case, because once they did finally name him the quarterback, they were just, over the moon in terms of how good they claimed they thought he was. And so he probably has a little bit more of a moat than that. But I mean, those are three passes that are pretty bad. And the fumble 6 is an egregious mistake, where we think about the sacks and how you need to limit some of these sacks. But also, if you're going to definitely get sacked in that situation, you can't also fumble it and give up a touchdown, because that changed the course of the game pretty dramatically. Now, the other play that can't happen, I mean, they were going to win this game going away because they were moving the ball at will in the first half. And the Antonio Gibson fumble, and he's kind of the other name that's pretty noteworthy in this. Now, I mean, we had made the case on the show and in the 0 RB candidates countdown that there was a massive gulf between Brian Robinson and Antonio Gibson, and it favored Robinson. And so for Gibson to still be going earlier was one of the weirdest kind of price setups that we had. You mentioned the nice touchdown for Robinson. He had some tough runs. I think if you are anti Brian Robinson, then you're like, I mean, he averaged 3.1 yards per carry. There wasn't a lot of dynamism right there. But Antonio Gibson basically not even involved in the game, in part because that fumble could have been a huge backbreaker. So you need to not have that mistake as well. I think if the Commanders hadn't committed so many just easy kind of giveaway mistakes, I mean, they would have won this game by 30. They would have been more aggressive kind of in the intermediate stages probably. But the key moment in this game is that after the fumble 6, instead of letting the first half run out, they have Howell drop back and air it out. And he reminded you again that he's got top 15 arm strength. I mean, one of the things that really popped today, and that Ben and I discussed a little bit on Ceiling Bananas, is that now that he is probably back, I mean, Matthew Stafford's arm talent stands out. Just, I mean, it blows you away.
That was one of my notes, and it wasn't that he had no touchdowns, no interceptions, but he had threw 38 times. But my fear with Stafford would be that if he's thrown 38 times in week 1, how that holds out throughout the year. But the 334 passing yards he had obviously didn't have Cooper Kupp. I thought his arm looked as good as it has over the last, I would say, 3 seasons.
He looked fantastic. And I wouldn't necessarily put Sam Howell in that category, but when you think about the combination of arm strength and release, when Howell decides to throw the ball, I mean, he gets it out of there. And we didn't see a lot of that in week 1. You had mentioned kind of the top of the show that, I mean, yeah, there were some good games, but it's frustrating to see a lot of these teams be boring or be ineffective. And the Commanders, I didn't think were that. I mean, one of the things is Howell can get the ball out and he's got some weapons. It didn't turn out to any kind of like amazing fantasy game by any stretch, but the fact that Curtis Samuel was involved, and especially involved in these drives where they were really trying to move it and look good, that's a big positive. I mean, Logan Thomas dropped some passes that he needs to catch, and yet 8 targets for him and the ability to get open more or less at will and to be that big-bodied, athletic tight end out there. I mean, he's not going to be remotely like Travis Kelce, but if you have that additional piece, then I think you have to really like that when you have someone in Antonio Gibson who, even though he only got 1 target today, does give you some potential dynamism as a receiver. And then you got Terry McLaurin and Jahan Dotson. And with those guys out there, I mean, this team is going to be able to move the ball. The fact that Howell came back after making some of those serious mistakes and they moved down the field for that field goal they should not have been able to get, and he made some huge throws during that stretch. Again, that's a positive. So you get both the high highs and the low lows with Howell in week 1. You think about how poorly the rookie quarterbacks played. You think about how poorly someone like a Trevor Lawrence played over the first really like not just his first season, but even the first third of last year. I mean, Sam Howell is not going to be a finished product in these next couple of weeks, but I thought there was enough there from a talent perspective that was encouraging. And you mentioned being excited by that touchdown run. I mean, I would like to see him, get across the line of scrimmage, get into space, get some more rushing yardage. He had a play today, I think, that was called back where he had done a little bit more of that. But the fact that he can give you that 15-yard run for a touchdown at a key moment, I mean, those are additional fantasy points beyond what would it be for a pass. And so he's going to be someone, I think, who keeps people in it and is going to give you those 20 to 25 point games in the right matchups.
You mentioned, Shawn, the LA Rams, and I don't think there's a huge amount to dive deep into in this, but Stafford looked, I thought, really good. I thought we would see in week one it was either the end of Stafford or there was something still there, and I think there's definitely something still there. The keynote here would be Kyren Williams had 15 carries for 52 yards, and he got the 2 touchdowns. We did have Cam Akers get in as well, but he had 22 for 29, 1.3 yards per carry with a long of 12. So not ideal. Williams' long was 9 as well, so they weren't breaking off huge chunks here in the run game. Tutu Atwell, though, 6 for 119 on 8 targets. We got Puka and Nacua with 10 receptions for 119 on 15 targets. So those guys pretty much took the Cooper Kupp role and split it between each other, but they done a really nice job of it. So that would be my kind of thoughts from the Rams side. They were, I think, better than I was anticipating heading in, especially without having Kupp there. And who knows, maybe when Kupp is back and now you have other options after him that we didn't think would be stepping up to the level in week one that they did here. I think that could make them very, very interesting. They were good on defense. Some of the questions are going to be going through from this week and working our way through the following weeks going up was some of these performances, the defense is so good that it made the offense look bad, or is it a case that the offenses are going to struggle throughout the season? So you mentioned in one of the games you talked to Ben about was the Steelers and the 49ers. The 49ers defense is going to be a legit defense all season. So the issues for the Steelers may be even more exaggerated, but they look like an offense who would have struggled even against an average defense in the way things were working yesterday. But that is no joke playing against the 49ers. But the Seattle Seahawks, Shawn, played against this Rams team, and I think the Rams are going to be good. But one of my things when we were doing kind of our preview to the season and what some things, one of the things I remember mentioning was Geno Smith. Is it a Cinderella story, or does he turn back into a pumpkin? This game was much more of the pumpkin variety as he went through here, which was very disappointing. We get Metcalf getting in the end zone. He has 47 yards on 3 receptions for 5 targets, but just the 16 completions off 26 for Geno Smith, 112 yards, 1 touchdown. I thought Kenneth Walker looked very explosive in the opportunities he had, but it was just the 12 carry, 64 yards in terms of on the ground for him. He did have 5 targets, 4 receptions, but only 3 yards. They were really just blanketed and smothered here by the Rams. Do you think this is one where it's the LA Rams have had a good game plan, played very well, got the lead? The Seattle Seahawks struggled to come from behind. Is that what we're seeing here from the Seahawks, or are we truly concerned? And the other part is there will be people with leagues where Atwell and Nacua are available on the waiver wires, in shallower leagues here. Probably not. I think Atwell potentially would be. Puka wouldn't be, with Kupp being out, obviously there was. But how aggressively should people be looking at those two guys, and how impressed were you with their performance?
Well, the flip side of that too is that Van Jefferson wasn't able to get involved and just is not a good player. And when you have those two dynamics in concert, then I do think the other guys are interesting. I think that the fact that Nacua carried the hype from the preseason, which we don't really usually get into the regular season. And when I say we don't usually get, is when the player is a later drafted guy who wasn't an elite prospect. Now, he did do some interesting things in his final year in college. But when you put all of that together with how well Stafford played, now Atwell is somebody who was fantastic in college and actually did jump out a little bit when you look at how last year finished. And so he was one of our 5 deep wide receiver targets. It's always kind of fun to see those guys hit right away. I don't know with the vertical player that you're going to get consistent production. And so there's a lot of possibility of picking someone like this up, playing them, not getting the points, you dump them again. It just becomes sort of a frustrating cycle. I think you've got to keep that in mind as a pretty strong possibility with the Rams. But certainly, I think that Atwell is more interesting than like a Josh Reynolds for Detroit, where, I mean, if he has another game like that this season, then Detroit is in trouble. It's a bad sign, not a good sign, right? So these young guys, and Atwell I still think falls into that category. I mean, you can definitely go out and target them in your waiver wire. Colm, one of the games that I have not had a chance to watch yet, it was wall-to-wall football for me today, about 10 hours worth. It did take a couple hour break to relax and try to come to terms with the J.K. Dobbins injury. But overall, a very, very enjoyable day of football. But one of the ones that I wasn't able to get in was your favorite team. And that is the Green Bay Packers mauling of the Chicago Bears. You've obviously watched this game. What's your biggest takeaway? We've been huge Romeo Doubs fans. It was worrying when he had the hamstring injury right before the season starts. It turns out that his teammate Christian Watson is the one who misses, and certainly with as good as the Packers looked, that is just a missed opportunity now that the Watson drafters are going to lament probably for a while. When you look at this game, and we know that Justin Fields is dynamic. We know that he has playmakers now. But this Chicago team is still a work in progress, right? We weren't expecting their defense to come out and be the 49ers, for example. But this is still a team where if you're the Packers, you need to score against them and you need to look good. And they did. Do we have a situation where the baton has now been passed from Brett Favre to Aaron Rodgers to Jordan Love? I mean, we have the next superstar here in Green Bay.
I think, Shawn, no, that's a little bit early to say that. I didn't talk it up much this offseason because, I don't like to talk up the Packers too much. I had a feeling that there's a chance that they would be much better than people had anticipated in terms of the reports out of camp with Jordan Love. I didn't think it would be this is probably best case scenario with how he played today. And it was a case where there was some passes that, again, could have been intercepted that weren't. But he had 245 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns. And the thing that we talked about with Aaron Rodgers last week when we were talking about the Jets is how much of what Green Bay did was Aaron Rodgers and how much was Matt LaFleur, and where was the meshing point of what they were balancing out. This felt like 100% Matt LaFleur doing exactly what he would want to do in terms of the play calling, how the offense was used. Very, very balanced. The highest amount of targets in this game is 5. Now, if we see a healthy Doubs, a healthy Watson, maybe that goes a different way. But, there's a lot of Aaron Jones had 4 targets, Musgrave had 4 targets, Reed had 4 targets, Doubs had 5 targets. Then we're down into, Turi and Dillon with 3. So we have a very balanced passing attack. There is only 15 completions, only the 27 targets. There's not a huge amount to spread around. But I think in terms of the game plan, it was exactly like they would want. We've seen kind of people open, which was one of the complaints I would have had about the offense the last season. There wasn't as many open players. And you're doing this without Christian Watson as well. You're doing it with a banged up Romeo Doubs, who I had quite a few leagues today where I sat Doubs. The news coming out was quite concerning in terms of, how much he would be limited on his snap count. The fact then was that he only needed 4 catches to get 2 touchdowns. So you can't really call that heading in as to how that'll play out. I was very impressed with the Packers here. They had some luck in terms of some of the plays. They have 2 fumbles in this game. They recover both of them. The Bears have 1 fumble. The Packers recover it. There was a Justin Fields fumble. Fields does have 1 interception, pretty bad interception, good read by the defender, but kind of staring down his wide receiver. And then we do see 216 passing yards for Fields, but that comes off 37 pass attempts. So there was concerns in the passing game. I think even that number is volume-based, but he does have the 59 rushing yards on the 9 carries. He looks great in scrambles, looks great when he's rushing the ball, but there is still some of those concerns around the passing game. So DJ Moore on the other side, only 2 targets for Moore, which I didn't think was great, but he was covered by Jair Alexander all game, so that he will shut down most wide receivers that he goes up against. So Darnell Mooney leading the way, 7 targets. We have 7 targets for Cole Kmet, 7 targets for Roschon Johnson, but not huge production on the Bears side. To talk about the Packers again, Jordan Love, I was very impressed with his overall performance. The other player, Shawn, that has to be highlighted here, I mentioned Doubs with the 2 touchdowns. Aaron Jones, unfortunately, picks up a hamstring strain that we'll see what the reports come out throughout the rest of this coming week as to how much time he may miss if he misses any. But on his 2nd touchdown, he pulls up just as he's about to go over the line, and he was kind of out then for the remainder of the game. But he has 2 receptions, 86 yards, 1 touchdown. That was a 51-yard touchdown reception that he did have that he pulled up at the end. Also was 9 for 41 and a touchdown on the ground. So I think Aaron Jones drafters would have been extremely happy at the point he's about to cross the line for that 2nd touchdown, and I think there'll be quite a bit of concern now as they move forward. But the Packers look like I would say what I would use the phrase as a complete team here, rather than trying to split directions between maybe what the quarterback wanted to do and what the offensive kind of coordinators wanted to do.
And even when you adjust for the Bears still being a work in progress, I think this has to be an extremely encouraging result.
Well, I think people were expecting the Packers to be a much bigger work in progress than the Bears. So for the way this went in week 1, I think is a big change in the landscape of that division. The other, and again, it could just be week 1. The other part of the division is, and we'll get to it maybe as the next game, is the Buccaneers turned over Minnesota, which really shakes that all up, with the Lions also beating the Chiefs on Thursday night.
Well, Colm, when I made the prediction that it was going to be Chiefs over Lions in the Super Bowl, I wasn't necessarily thinking that both teams would go out there to start the season and look very poor. And yet, that's a huge win for the Lions as they look to do their part of it. And I have to say, it does seem like the NFC North is going to be one of the weakest divisions. Not as weak as the NFC South, but your Packers could come out of it. My Lions could come out of it. That's going to be an interesting battle. You mentioned that the Minnesota Vikings dropped this game to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. That has to be one of the biggest surprise results of the week. Maybe the most surprising thing is that Baker Mayfield throws 34 passes, and not all of them were into the offensive line. He completes 21, only 5 yards per.
Yeah, Shawn, 173 passes. Let's not talk it up too much. It was...
But he throws a couple of touchdowns. He competed. He threw his body around out there as he is wont to do. I mean, the thing that you like from a Baker Mayfield is that he is a competitor, and that in some occasions will compensate for the lack of arm talent. You get a game here where Rachaad White was one of the trendy guys in fantasy over the last 6 weeks. He was kind of on our do not draft list. Michael Dudner had a piece out specifically explaining why you didn't want to draft him, and I think that is pretty well illustrated today with 17 carries for 39 yards. When you don't hit 2.5, when you look far more sluggish than Leonard Fournette, that's a little bit of an issue there. He does catch a couple of passes. Sean Tucker, 5 for 15, doesn't do anything special with his opportunities either. But you get Mike Evans, the news with him that they fail to extend the contract. I don't think that's a huge surprise. I'm sure the Buccaneers are thinking that they are rebuilding and wanting to go in a slightly different direction there, but he does look good. 6 catches, 66 yards, catches a touchdown, does drop what could have potentially been another touchdown. So not a game completely without blemish. But for Evans and Godwin to combine for 11 catches, neither one of these guys really popped, and yet I think it has to at least relieve a little bit of the stress from, say, their dynasty managers, other people who are putting them out there in lineups today, because it looks like the floor is not going to be absolute zero. And so you contrast that with some of the other situations around the league. Maybe you're going to get a little bit from there. This Minnesota game was very similar to the Broncos game in that Kirk Cousins and Russell Wilson moved the ball at will in the first half, and then the tap just completely shut off, and Minnesota wasn't able to do anything in the second half there. Part of that, I think...
The tap might have been called Justin Jefferson, was it?
Well, he goes 9 for 150, and he certainly shows why he was the 101. It was in the first half. You also get a Jordan Addison touchdown in the first half. One of the things that was a little bit bizarre to me is that KJ Osborne drew 6 targets and just seems far more involved than his talent would justify. You get also 4 targets to an Alexander Madison. He does score a receiving touchdown. When you get 4 points through the receptions and the yardage, you get the additional touchdown points. You get 6 points in the passing game. I think you're going to be very excited. The flip side of that, though, is that in a game where he scored a touchdown and caught 3 passes, Madison is still even... a lot of players in the starting lineups scored fewer points today, but this game was another illustration of the problem that you have with an Alexander Madison, which is that he doesn't give you anything as a runner. He's a guy that you can balance out your offense with by giving him some touches and soak those plays out of the game. But it's more like you're just trying to kill the game with those opportunities. When you don't have Dalvin Cook's athleticism, electricity, his big playability, then you're going to get only what Kirk Cousins gives you. And I mean, again, this was kind of a Kirk Cousins game where he completes 33 out of 44. He throws for 344 yards, 2 touchdowns. A lot of fantasy managers are like, that would be nirvana compared to maybe what they got from someone they were expecting more from this week. And yet, I mean, this is a disastrous performance for a team that was trying to take the next step after they had a season last year that was kind of fluky. And so they're a team that people are selling because of the point differential, because of the luck that they had in some of these games, because of the weak schedule that they faced last year. They had a chance to go out there and make a statement. They moved the ball, but there are still big problems with this offense. And one of the things that I would say is it's a little bit difficult to evaluate Jordan Addison because his touchdown is a little bit on a broken coverage. You know, when you're 15 yards behind the defender and your quarterback hits you, you should catch that for a touchdown. And yet I still really like this Jefferson, Addison, Hawkinson combo. Hawkinson did a little bit more, maybe what the Lions were selling him for today, where he catches 8 passes but only gains 35 yards. I mean, that's a very Zach Ertz line right there. When you get the 9 targets, you'd like to do more with it. But unlike some of the teams we talked about, unlike the Cardinals, I mean, this is a game where the big 3 do get 27 combined targets. This team is going to be fine, but it's always tough when you have to lean on a Kirk Cousins. He's better in a game manager role, which is why you need a back like Dalvin Cook.
Yeah, the part of this is a game I think that Minnesota should never have lost, even as the game went on, even as they go into the fourth quarter. In terms of, like, Cousins is 33 of 44 for 2 touchdowns, 1 interception, but he has 344 passing yards. In terms of the yardage totals from one team to the other, there is like no comparison in what is happening throughout this entire game. And it feels like this is the type of game that, unfortunately for Vikings fans, that Kirk Cousins and the Vikings tend to lose. They really were just moving it down the field at will in that first half. They kind of obviously they're trying to stop Justin Jefferson in that first half, but they do a much better job of it in the second. And yeah, really, really poor loss here from the Vikings. I think they'll be perfectly fine for fantasy. I think they'll have some issues going forward. This is a bad loss. Shawn, you mentioned Russell Wilson as another quarterback who was moving the ball. I thought Wilson in the first half looked great in this game. He goes 27 of 34 with just 177 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions. They do lose 17-16 to the Las Vegas Raiders at home. Javonte Williams has 13 carries for 52 yards. P. Ryan's in there with 8 for 41. P. Ryan, like this is where the problem starts here for the Broncos. Not that P. Ryan has the most yards, but the most yards been 37 yards, 4 for 37 for him. Troutman, 5 targets, 5 receptions, 34 yards. We're getting low yardage totals. Cortland Sutton gets in the end zone with a nice grab. Dulcich picks up an injury in this one, just the 2 targets before he leaves at that particular point. Very spread out offense, lots of people getting targets, but the game plan here just really fell away for me in the second half. On the other side, the Raiders felt a little bit in this game like what we've seen with Tampa Bay, but they just had a more elevated end result in terms of what they were able to do yardage-wise. We get Jakobi Meyers took a really nasty hit towards the end of this. We're waiting on reports, but hopefully he will be okay as the season goes on. I would expect that there is a concussion there, but he gets 10 targets, 9 receptions, 81 yards, 2 touchdowns, a really big game for him in his kind of season debut for the Raiders. Devontae Adams, 9 targets, 6 receptions, 66 yards, but this was one of the most concentrated offenses, Shawn, of the entire day here for the Raiders. Did you feel positive in what we've seen from Denver today? I think it was, again, a game of 2 halves, and the first half looked really positive for them. The second half led back to some concerns towards last season.
Yeah, I just think you have to be more aggressive, and you really need to not have a game plan that features so many peripheral players. You don't want, as you mentioned, P. Ryan leading the way. It was great to see him look decent. He had a short yardage carry where he tries to break it outside, gets tackled, is not able to fight through that tackle after he tries to go around the defender. That's about as poor a running back play as you're going to see, especially from a big back, where once you get one-on-one with that defender, you have to pick up the 18 inches and get the first down. I was a little bit concerned that as a result of that, we were going to get less of him. Obviously, there's been a lot of buzz about their young rookie third string back, but in the end, we get 21 combined carries from Williams and P. Ryan. And unlike a team like the Chiefs, some of these other teams where we talk so much about the dead zone profile for the running backs and the dead zone guys, now not the big time talents, but the players who were there purely because of projected workload, they were awful in week 1. Now, a few of them did find the end zone at different points. We mentioned the receiving touchdown for Alexander Madison. Obviously, you get a touchdown there for Cam Akers, even though he loses 2. So a few of these guys got in the end zone, but you can see the difference between guys like Javonte Williams and Samaje Perine and some of these other players. I mean, obviously, Joe Mixon, a back who should be in the dead zone. People haven't figured that part out yet. But you get the dynamism in the running game, and yet they ran the ball too much in the second half, and it shut down what was such an incredibly promising performance from Russell Wilson in the first half. Now, in the end here, he only averages about 5 yards per attempt, and so that's not a dynamic game overall. But you could see today where once they get Marvin Mims up to speed, once you get a Jerry Jeudy out there, that with Sean Payton, that everything was just so much sharper, so much more dynamic. The tempo that they played with, the intent that they played with. I think this is going to be a good Denver team, but I'm also concerned that this Las Vegas team is pretty mediocre and that you needed to actually win this one if you were going to make the statement that you're hoping to make. If you're trying to make the next step, really, I mean, statements don't matter. You need to put a win in the victory column. And so you look at what Las Vegas was able to do by staying close. And then, I mean, you get a performance here from Josh Jacobs where he averages 2.5 yards per carry. You have a situation where on his 3 targets, he's a little bit more dynamic than that. But if you shut Josh Jacobs down the way that Denver did today, and you limit Devontae Adams to only 6 catches for 66 yards and create some frustrations there, I mean, you absolutely have to win this game. But the guy that we mentioned being a little bit of a thorn in the side of a Devontae Adams, maybe was going to make the game a little bit more pass-oriented, probably won't have any issues for a Josh Jacobs who still profiles very nicely, certainly after he's had some more time to practice. And one of the things that we were dealing with in week 1 is that either because players were injured and sitting out, or holding out and sitting out, or were simply not playing in preseason games in order to not get injured, you did get the impression that most of the teams were not ready to play. Week 2, week 3, week 4, we're going to see different teams here. I wouldn't be worried about Josh Jacobs. I wouldn't be worried about Devontae Adams. But Jakobi Meyers is the huge story. And his metrics, we talked about all summer, that they were very, very good with New England, that New England was getting a massive downgrade in going from him to Juju, and that just nothing about that made any sense. Jakobi Meyers could be this secondary target for Josh McDaniels that he got with a Wes Welker, that he got with a Julian Edelman. Jakobi Meyers, and hopefully he's okay after this hit at the end of the game, because, I mean, he looked like maybe the biggest league winner of all players in week one. When you think about what he was able to do in this game, Colm, Jakobi Meyers was not a priority target for us, but he was one of these guys where we liked what he's done. We thought that there was some potential there if Jimmy Garoppolo played well. Every time that I got in trouble in an underdog draft where you get into that kind of middle range and you weren't able to beat the Avalanche, and Jakobi Meyers was there, he was the pick. I love all of that exposure. We're thinking of him, fingers crossed that he will be okay.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Hopefully we'll get some positive reports. I expect week 2 will not be in play for him, but as the season goes on, hopefully we see him back out there. Shawn, we're going to touch on 2 games here very, very rapidly. The other games then that I'm going to mention that are topic of Stadium Bananas that I mentioned is Miami and the Chargers. We're going to talk a little bit about that quickly, but we have San Francisco and Pittsburgh, Atlanta, Carolina, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Jacksonville, Indianapolis, and we're going to touch on 2 of those games just quickly to give some thoughts. I'm sure people are interested. The Miami Dolphins 36, Chargers 34. Tua looked amazing in this game. Some of the touch passes, particularly to the last Tyreek Hill touchdown, he just fitting it in the bucket. We talked about how defenses might change to try and slow these teams down. The speed of Hill and Waddle is going to make that a challenge, as these guys just look to be open for chunk plays time and time again. But it was Tyreek Hill who had more yards receiving than many quarterbacks had this week. 11 for 215 and 2 on 15 targets. An incredible efficiency from him. We have Jalen Waddle 4 for 78 and 5. Did look good, but obviously wasn't getting as much involved. Durham Smythe getting 7 targets, 3 for 44 for him. Mostert 10 carries for 37 yards, 1 touchdown going his way. He had 2 for 13 through the air, but Tua had 28 of 45 for 466, 3 touchdowns, 1 interception, and amazing performances. Did have 2 fumbles, lost one. One was recovered by the Dolphins. On the other side, Shawn, it looked pretty positive in the first half here as they moved through for the Chargers in terms of how things were going. But Herbert finishes with just a 228 yards, 1 touchdown from his side. He did have 1 rushing touchdown where he pushes it over the goal line. Austin Eckler, 117 yards on 16 carries, 1 touchdown. We do get Joshua Kelly involved quite a lot in this, Shawn. 16 for 91, 1 touchdown for him as well. Keenan Allen looked pretty fresh in this game. Austin Eckler also 47 yards and 4 receptions through the air. But outside of that, not a huge amount of note to add in. Quentin Johnson, the 3 targets, 2 for 9 from his day out. I know you and Ben talked about this quite a bit on Stadium Bananas, but just wanted to give a shout out to the Miami Dolphins. I'll give you an opportunity if you want to mention more about that after we hint on the Jacksonville Jaguars. You talked about the Colts with Ben, but I thought Trevor Lawrence looks again like he has potentially taken that next step forward. Nothing spectacular in terms of his box score today. 21 rushing yards and 7 attempts for him. He has 32 pass attempts, 24 completions, 241 yards, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception. But he looked fantastic in terms of getting the offense in and out of plays and so on. But Calvin Ridley, Sean's the story coming out of this. 11 targets for him, 8 receptions, 101 yards, 1 touchdown. Looked fantastic. One of the players of the day. And then Zay Jones had 7 targets, 5 receptions, 55 yards, 1 touchdown. I guess the player who really missed out on this one is Christian Kirk. Just 3 targets for him, 1 for 9. We have the Bigsby ETN who gets the workload. We do get Bigsby in for a goal line carry, gets his touchdown, 7 for 13 yards, 1 touchdown for him. Gets 1 target, no receptions. ETN, though, 18 for 77, 1 touchdown. The touchdown being a 26-yard run kind of to seal this game out. Then he also has 5 for 27 on 5 targets through the air. I thought he looked really good. And one play that if you have a chance to go back and watch the Calvin Ridley touchdown, Ridley is fast, Ridley's running down the sideline to hope to get into the end zone. Travis Etienne passes him, Shawn, and puts in the lead block to open up that pass. So, we sometimes joke about coaches and narratives and what they want to see. If we want to see more Travis Etienne, I think if he's like lead blocking for his wide receiver and he's like outrunning one of the fastest players on the entire roster, I think that's a good sign for Etienne when we get just keep telling the coaches to watch that film. He's an effort guy.
He looks also that was the play that was the play. I mean, if we're thinking about the same one where Ridley ends up taking like 5 steps out of bounds, or else would have.
Oh yeah, sorry, he didn't get in. He didn't get in. You are correct.
But yeah, I mean, the 2 plays in this game, where number one, the touchdown run at the end was sensational, but it doesn't stand out the way that the one that you just mentioned, where he goes flying by him like he's standing still. And now, granted, Calvin Ridley's trying to make moves
like he's on a motorbike.
It was extraordinary. So you see the speed, you see the hustle. He actually lays a great block, as you mentioned, the narrative stuff and the toughness and all of that. I mean, if he wants to, be out there and go for the 1,600 to 1,700 yards,
spring running backs that we don't want to see, but we want to see more ETN here as we move forward.
It was awfully cool. And one of the things that was a big red flag for ETN by a lot of analysts coming into the season was just, how involved he would be in the passing game. To catch 5 passes, even though, what he was able to do with them in this game didn't turn out to be that meaningful. It's absolutely huge. And we talked about how, coming out of college, he had some great.
He looked absolutely huge in terms of size.
ETN?
Yeah.
Wearing the big shoulder pads?
I think you might have had an extra large in the shoulder pads this week.
This one was extremely exciting. You mentioned Ridley. He deserves a lot of credit. Looked great. I think this is a wonderful story, right? We talk about the risk of drafting someone who has missed all of that time, the risk of drafting him that early. And yet you want to see the player come through. You don't want it to be a Josh Gordon situation. You don't want it to be one of these deals where a guy's career and life gets derailed and can't get it back on. He looked fantastic. And we hope that he continues to hit over and over all season long. I guess I wouldn't exactly expect that when you see the kind of catch that Zay Jones put in. And you think about the contract that Christian Kirk has and how well he played last season. For him to catch 1 pass for 9 yards, that's not what the season's going to look like. Evan Ingram is the guy that I felt the most comfortable targeting. I didn't really target any of the guys in this passing game because of the prices that each of them were commanding, with the risk with Ridley just at that price, and with coming off of the suspension, when you're going to be in an offense that is probably split between the 4 guys. But then Evan Ingram, probably my preference, because he allows you to address a difficult position at a price that is reasonable. He looked pretty good in this game as well. I guess the biggest disappointment, even though Trevor Lawrence looked fine, as you mentioned, is just that when you have those 4 guys plus a Travis Etienne, you need to throw for more than 241. You need to blow out an Indianapolis Colts team, and this game should not have been competitive. So
it also had one of the weirdest defensive returns for a touchdown that I've seen in some time, where Tanks, it's a fumble. Bigsby picks it up, but kind of stands there. I think he might have thought it was an incomplete pass. The defender knocks it out of his hand, and they return it for a touchdown, which obviously kept the game a lot closer if that didn't come into the factors. But a really weird defensive return for a touchdown there.
Yeah, and on that one, the officials did the opposite of what they did in the Titans-Saints game, where
they blew the whistle.
Yeah, that game
and then didn't give the fumble.
That game was stolen from the Titans, but I think at the same time, you've got to be able to beat Derek Carr regardless of situation. So, an exciting week 1 column. A lot of teams still with a lot of work to do, but a lot of potential here, and individual performances that stand out. Some high scores in fantasy, some really low scores. We know Tyreek Hill is not going to be able to put up 200 yards every week. We know that guys like Christian Kirk and Drake London are not going to put up either actual zeros or virtual zeros. T. Higgins, when you get a total of 1.9 points from Christian Kirk, T. Higgins, and Drake London put together, then you know that you're going to get bounce back performances. You would like to see a little bit more volume for those guys to kind of bounce back with, though. I mean, for these guys, this was not necessarily a situation where you're looking at the air yards and be like, oh, yeah, they're going to hit. These 3 players need to be more involved next week. I think they will be.
Yeah, let's hope so. And excited for week 2. Week 1 is not over yet, though. Monday Night Football coming up. We get to see what Aaron Rodgers, Wilson, Breece Hall, how that all shakes out against the juggernaut that is the Buffalo Bills. So should be a fun one on Monday Night Football. If your games are close, if you're waiting for certain things to happen in those games, hopefully they fall in your favor and you can get that week 1 win to kick it off in a nice way. That is going to do it for today's episode. I mentioned already lots of the other games covered on Stadium Bananas. We will be finalizing the schedule for the recap shows and so on and so forth, how that will play out over the coming weeks. But we will be back with our Wednesday edition here on RotoViz Overtime. Make sure you are subscribed to the podcast feed. You'll get that once it comes out. We'll have more thoughts on week 1. We'll be looking ahead to week 2 and much, much more. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. You can check out his work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.